Good afternoon to everybody. In fact, as a part of my previous discussion on means of knowledge and particularly the scientific method, I thought today I will be discussing with you this theme, scientific knowledge, and then after this discussion, we will go back to different ways of doing Buddhist research and studies. Why I particularly wanted to discuss this matter with you is because we need to, when we study research methodology, we need to have general knowledge about the concept of knowledge in the modern times. And when we are talking about the concept of knowledge, particularly today, necessarily we will have to discuss what scientific knowledge means. Now, when we use the word science, we very often use it. We use this word science very often. But it is not very likely that we have a very clear idea about what science means. We mean many different things, but very often we mean by science actually a product of science, namely technology. Now, very often we are using this term to refer to technology. So we have public speaking system, we have electricity, we have all the other facilities, so which are results of products of scientific knowledge. So today in our life actually, if you look at the life about say 150 to 200 years ago, today life is unimaginably changed. But we are born into that change, so we don't even feel it now. But on the other hand, if we really think, we know that science has made tremendous changes in every part of our life. So I don't need to describe that because that is everybody's knowledge. Now, basically, we mean technology when we talk about science. Actually, technology is not really science. Technology is, we can say, result of science. The technological machinery and the innovations, public speaking systems, communication systems, and the transport. Now, these are really, in a way, byproduct of science. Today, we think that we are living in a globalized society. Now, this globalization actually the result of, in a way, science and technology. So scientific knowledge has turned into technology. As a result, communication is world over. So what I'm saying right now is being heard by many others is simply because of communication. Now, say 100 years ago, it is impossible to imagine that, you speak from one person and, remote places people can hear. Of course, in the Buddhist tradition, we had this Dibba Sota, Dibba Chakku and all these things. But apart from those things, it is unimaginable for people to. And also, movement of people from continent to continent, countries to country, it's again transport. So transport and communication, these are two very important areas. But these areas also result of scientific knowledge. But what is science? What do we really mean by science? It's very important thing. Now, particularly when we, as a group of people who are very much interested in research and study. Now, of course, research doesn't mean only Buddhist research, as you know. There are so many subjects in all these subjects. People do various types of studies and research. But as a group of people who are studying Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy, Buddha's teachings, we are, as a group of people who are interested in Buddhist research, we also need to know what is science, basically. Because, without science, we can't live today. The scientific knowledge, we accept so much. we have so much faith, so much trust in scientific knowledge. Sometimes, this faith is even to the extent that, it's a kind of blind faith. Because, people believe in so much. Now, for example, many people believe in Western medicine so much. You go to a doctor gives some pills. I mean, without any problem, you just start swallowing it, and we don't know what we are getting. But, now more and more people, when they get medicine, they go and, they Google it and they see the name and then they see what the product is. But, that is done by very few people. But usually we have a lot of faith. So, we have so much faith in technology, so much faith in science, where technology comes from. But basically, we need to know what science is. So today what I'm going to do is actually to talk to you basically, briefly what science is. Then we are going to talk about the scientific method. Now, when we discuss scientific method, you will see that approach, our discussion on scientific method is very much relevant to the kind of research we are doing. Okay, so it is relevant to the Buddhist research also. Also, it is important for us to understand any other kind of research and knowledge that is happening in the world. So therefore, as a part of Buddhist research methodology, I thought I will be today discussing basically what this subject, scientific knowledge. But to begin with, what is science? Now basically science is empirical method of knowledge acquisition. So empirical method of knowledge acquisition. Knowledge acquisition. You remember in the beginning of this series, I discussed with you how to produce new knowledge. Now research is basically to produce new knowledge. So then we looked at different ways how we can produce new knowledge in Buddhism. Now here, science is basically a knowledge acquisition. So we gain knowledge, we gather knowledge. But then empirical method of knowledge acquisition, basically the method, this empirical method means that is the method we are using by making use of our sensory perception. So by using our senses, we are studying nature or any phenomenon. So therefore, here you can see the definition of science. Of course, there are many definitions for science. This definition has two important terms, empirical method and knowledge acquisition. Empirical method. So the method is empirical. Method is something that can be tested. Now, through that we acquire knowledge. Now, you remember in my last discussions, two discussions, we talked about rationalism and empiricism. And then rationalism was the idea that knowledge comes from our inner ideas. So knowledge comes from at least some fundamentals of knowledge coming from our inner mind, by analysis of mind. Plato believed that we are born with knowledge. And Descartes believed that if we really meditate on our mind, we can discover clear and distinct ideas which are indubitable, which you cannot doubt. Now you see, they are talking about knowledge, but where is the knowledge coming from? So according to them, knowledge was coming from our internal brain or mind, whatever. And then subsequently, I told you this story about when this question arose, how many teeth are there in horse's mouth? All these ancient venerable clergy went into the ancient books. They thought that all the right knowledge is contained in the books. So they started turning the pages of the books, looking for the answer. But then this young guy who came without knowing anything much about, then he inquired. He was told, these venerable people are looking for this answer for this question. He went into laughter. because he did not know about all these sacred traditions. He thought this is ridiculous. If you want to know how many teeth are there in horse's mouth, the best thing is you get the horse down, open the mouth and count the tooth. And then, you know how many teeth are there in horse's mouth. Now, that story is a representative story of science. That young clergy, without much experience, what he proposed is the empirical method. Empirical method. You open the mouth of a horse and you count them, and then you know how many teeth are there. Now that is the empirical method. Now if you have it in a book can say many things, but how do you know that? But the whole idea was that empirical method. Now this is something very important. Now we have to know that this empirical method, particularly we are talking about modern science. Modern science is something very much started in Europe and came into other places. Now this did not start that easily in Europe. Up to about 15th century, it was basically the Roman Catholic tradition, and not very easy. Now, when we look at the end of Middle Ages, the worldview was that correct account of the world is found in Aristotle and also in the Bible. So, of course, Aristotle was a great philosopher, but on the other hand, his ideas influence human history in a way we can say very bad manner. I remember when I was reading Bertrand Russell, he says that Aristotle's influence was very bad on the the development of science. One particular view was that what was believed to be the geocentric view of the universe. Geocentric view of the universe means they believed that this earth is the center of the universe. So whole universe is rotating around the world, this world. So this world was believed to be the center of the universe. Now this is called geocentric view of universe. Geocentric. Now why this idea came? Because this is basically came from influence by the Bible. Because the creation of the world was understood to be the creation of this world. So this is the God creation. Now God's creation is considered to be the best of the all creations. So therefore people believe that the center of the universe is the earth. So everything including sun and moon, everything goes around the earth. Now this was the view that was held up to say 15th century, up to that time. And then we know this Johannes Copernicus. Johannes Copernicus is a mathematician. He calculated and he came to know that this view is wrong. Okay, he calculated through his calculations, mathematical calculations, Copernicus knew that this view was wrong. However, that this view was conclusively wrong was established by Galileo. Right? Galileo, when he invented the telescope, of course, very elementary instrument compared with, more sophisticated instrument today. But through his telescope, what he said was, completely, totally the revolutionary. What Copernicus said through mathematical calculations, Galileo saw it. So he could establish that this worldview, geocentric worldview, is wrong. And subsequently what came is, we say, heliocentric view of universe. Heliocentric view of universe means the sun-centered. So this view said that actually it is not that sun is going around the earth is going around the sun, and earth is of course not one of the biggest, actually it's a middle-sized planet that goes around the earth, the sun. So, the whole view changed from geocentric universe to heliocentric universe. So, now this is sometimes called Copernican revolution. Copernican revolution is. This is, I mean, the mathematically discovered, established by Copernicus. So the geocentric universe is wrong, heliocentric view. But then Galileo who established it. But there is a very interesting writing by Bertrand Russell again on this. He says that Galileo was summoned by the church, and then Galileo asked to withdraw what he said. Because, you know, we are talking about the period of Inquisition. You know what Inquisition means in European history? Inquisition means all those people who held heretical views, wrong views, views considered to be wrong by the church, were, some people were burned alive, many people were burned alive, others were killed, excommunicated, and a lot of things. And it is believed that so many people, several hundreds or thousands of people all over that area of the world were executed through Inquisition. Inquisition was a kind of doctrinal board, who decided, and they decided Galileo's view was wrong. And then Galileo was asked by Inquisition to withdraw his finding. Now, how can Galileo withdraw what he sees from his eyes? Then according to Bertrand Russell, now Galileo, if he were to live, he has to withdraw the idea. Then what he did was, he wrote a long letter to the church, withdrawing it. But he wrote in such a complicated manner, Bertrand Russell says that he really confirmed his finding, but it appeared to be a withdrawal. In other words, the church could not understand it really. But Galileo did not really withdraw it, but by way of withdrawing, he wrote a long letter, and he could survive. But these are some of the very interesting things when we look at the development of modern science, how modern science came up. You see, so this empirical method is now what Galileo saw through his telescope was still empirical, because you are using an instrument and you are seeing from your eye. But on the other hand, people like Copernicus established this through reasoning or mathematics. But ultimately, the scientific knowledge is considered to be, of course, mathematics is not rejected. Mathematics, logic, statistics, all these are made use of in the process. But basically what is happening is, in the scientific method, you are using empirical method, experience, sensory experience. So this is basically how the scientific knowledge came. So whatever is within your sensory experience, you acquire knowledge through that. So this was the basic idea in science. Now this was emphasized. What was accepted before that. One thing is the sacred text and sacred books, and that aspect, and also the other is what is called rationalism. So against these things, science is considered to be the empirical method of knowledge acquisition. So science is basically two things. One thing is science is knowledge, which means that it refers to a body of knowledge. Okay? And then, how do we get that knowledge? We get it from empirical method. So science is also the method. Science is also the method. Method of acquisition of knowledge is science, and also the body of knowledge so acquired is also science. So when we use the term science, we have to be careful in what sense we are using this term. Okay? Now, main steps in scientific process: observation, hypothesis, prediction or predictions, and then the experiment. The best hypothesis leads to predictions that can be tested. Now, all these terms are very important. So through observation, hypothesis, prediction and experiment. Now these are basically 4 interconnected steps or stages of acquisition of scientific knowledge. Now, in other words, we are talking about the scientific method. In fact, in this discussion, I am not going to talk about some of these things. The very concept of the scientific method has come under a lot of criticism. There are lots of philosophers who say many things about these things. Some people say, really there is no such thing called scientific method, and there is no one method, and the many. So the very idea of how science acquires knowledge also has been changed. However, what remains basically unchanged is this empirical basis, okay? For in order something to be science, in order something to be proved, that knowledge has to come from empirical method. And also it must be testable. Now you remember when I was talking to you on the knowledge, I said justified true belief. Now justification, there comes this concept of justification. Justification is this. Now, it is not only sufficient to say that I have some knowledge. I must be able to share it with others, and others also must be able to get that knowledge. Otherwise, I simply say that I have some knowledge, it's no use. If you cannot get that, what is the use of that? But the justification is very important, and particularly in science, it must be justified, because others must be able to share it. Now, I will give you a very simple example. Now, when you are going to, high school or your school days, you study science, and then you have certain text to study science. Now, what you do is, you look at the text and you look some experiment, you go to the laboratory. In the laboratory, what you do is, you follow that test and you do the test, and then you see the result. Now, this is a pretty basic thing in science. Of course, in the laboratory, in the school lab, what you do is, pretty small, simple things. But from those simple things, even to the very big things, science is that. Basically, you acquire some knowledge, and then you must be able to establish that knowledge. So here we have observation, hypothesis, predictions, and experiment. It's something like this. You observe certain phenomena. You observe certain things. Now, observation means empirical, right? Either you hear something or you see something, whatever the observation is that. Now, in order to understand this, what you observe, you create certain set of hypotheses. Okay, this must be because of this. This must be because of this. In that manner, in order to explain what you observe, you create certain situations. Okay, you say this, hypothesis 1. You say this happens because of this and this and this. Hypothesis number 2, you say this happens not because of that, something. So when you make a set of hypotheses for an observation, there can be certain hypotheses you can simply reject as irrelevant. But ultimately, there can be some very plausible hypotheses. That means there can be a hypothesis. Hypothesis, another word is conjecture. Now, hypothesis, conjecture, which means you suspect something to be the case. You think something to be the case. Now, how are you going to do that? Like very often, suppose every night some stones fall on the roof, making big noise. Now, you don't see where the stones are coming. Now, naturally what you have is your hypothesis. Okay, the next door neighbor doesn't like you very much. So, number one hypothesis, next door neighbor is throwing the stones. I mean, there can be many other hypotheses too, right? But then you go for the most plausible one. So, you observe some phenomenon, and then you try to explain that phenomenon. I mean, there are many interesting stories in science, like I think one of these solar system, I think Neptune or Jupiter was discovered like that. When the calculations were made, they noticed that the calculations doesn't go exactly correctly. So then they assume that there must be another heavenly object that goes. So that was the hypothesis. But of course, they just wanted to explain that observation. What they observe is these mathematical calculations don't go exactly the way they expected. So they thought that there must be some other object that influences the movement of this particular thing. So with that conjecture, they did the research and they observed, and then they discovered another, the planet. So like that. So you have observations, then you have hypotheses. Ultimately, what you take to be hypothesis, the most successful one is if you can make predictions successfully, then that hypothesis is, so you make predictions, and through experiment, you try to establish your predictions. So you see observation, hypothesis, predictions, and then finally you have experiment. Experiment is, something you do. Now, this can be many different forms. It is not only one thing. Like, in a given situation, suppose you are a plant biologist or something, and then you want to do a certain research. Now, for example, I remember when I was a graduate studying philosophy, I had another friend of mine who was doing research in Hawaiian Islands, where I did my doctorate. In Hawaiian Islands, there is pineapple. Now that in this pineapple, in Hawaiian type of pineapple, they had some issues. One problem was these pineapples were quite sour, not very sweet tasty. Now they wanted to know why it is so, and then what are the conditions that influence this pineapple to be so sour, and then they wanted to remedy it. Now, it was a part of, scientific research. So they hired a group of scientists to look for the reason. So, you go by certain hypotheses. Okay, this is, it is an island surrounded by sea, so maybe because of the salinity of the water, and, many hypotheses were there. But then finally, they isolated something very importantly, what caused that type of sourness in the pineapple. Now, that's a perfect example for how a scientific research. You observe something. What you observe is the salinity, the sourness of the pineapple. And then you have certain hypotheses. And then you say, okay, if you do these things, you say it will be changed, prediction. And then in order to prove that, you do experiments, right? Now, this is what basically science is doing in a very small manner or large manner. So this particular. Now, this particular 4 things don't take as a recipe, because as I said earlier, scientific research can take many forms. Depending on the scientist, depending on the situations. Sometimes, scientists can be a lucky person, who discovers something without much effort, There can be many things in this whole thing. But basically, what we cannot reject in scientific thing is this, the starting from observation, and then ultimately we experiment. And then the best hypothesis leads to predictions that can be tested. So ultimately, that can be tested means the justification aspect. So I do this and I get this result, and the idea is that somebody else repeat my test under similar condition, he or she must be able to get the same result. Now, under the same conditions, if somebody else did the research, if they got different results, then of course it has to be viewed carefully. Why, went it wrong or went it differently from the other? So again, you can test it. So this is basically the scientific knowledge. So the testability is very important. Justification is important. through your sensory experience, you gather these things, and then, now this is very much happening in the medical science. Now, for example, medical science, they are doing lots of research to find a solution, find a medicine for cancer, find a medicine for AIDS, find medicine for Alzheimer's disease, all kind. So there's quite a lot of things are happening. So they are happening basically observation, hypothesis, predictions, experiment, this kind of process. So I don't want to take too much time of you, but basically, ultimately, what is science? Science is a body of knowledge. But that body of knowledge acquired through empirical method, right? Now today, of course, nobody is really debating about the reliability of your experience, so we take experience to be, the most reliable source of knowledge. Now, of course, for this experience, we make use of instruments. It can be a microscope that you can see extremely minute thing and enlarge it, or telescope where you can see extremely far away objects. So you are making all these gadgets, but still you are making your sensory experience the means. Okay, so this is basically what we mean by scientific knowledge. So science is the empirical method of knowledge acquisition, observation, hypothesis, predictions, and experiment. So the best hypothesis leads to predictions that can be tested. So this is basically the idea. Then I would like to go into two ways of scientific reasoning, induction and deduction. But before going into induction and deduction, do you have any questions or anything about, I think, just last 30 minutes? Yes, sir, go ahead.
The science so you show 4 steps for the definition of the science process.
Mm-hmm.
But how is concerned relate to the religion, especially Buddhism?
Okay, that's very important. Actually, what happened around the world is basically with scientific knowledge, what is found in religions, some of the things were rejected. And some of the things were rejected because these things cannot be established scientific sensory experience. Now, there is so much debate about this aspect. Do we simply reject something simply because it is not in accordance with science? In a religion, there can be many things that you cannot really establish exactly the science talks about. Now, how do we go with these things? Now, Reverend, actually, you asked some very important, interesting question, but answering that question is a very long process because, in fact, there are certain things science say. Now, for example, certain things we can conclusively, fairly simply say that now, say, for example, in Buddhism, we say Sasa Jataka. Sasa Jataka says that Shakra, king of gods, took this rabbit and draw the rabbit on the moon. Now this story comes in a worldview of universe where people thought that, moon is some kind of round object, something exact like we see in the sky today. So, you go and you draw something. But if the people had an idea that moon is not like a small round object, but it is a sub-planet or something, it's a world, then people will not have that kind of thing. But then we can say that, look, so Sasa Jataka cannot stand the scientific knowledge. So we can say rejected. But the funny thing is this. Now, if the religion has only that kind of stories, that type of religion will be disappeared with the science. Because, many people tend to think that those are wrong, false things. But however, interesting thing is, religion did not disappear. Not only Buddhism, any other religions did not disappear. So on the one hand, we talk about science, but on the other hand, we believe in quite a lot of things that are said in religion. Now here what is interesting thing is the scientific knowledge, empirical knowledge we need to live. But at the same time, in order to live, we also need many other types of emotional things. So religion provides, any religion in that sense, not only Buddhism, any religion provides for people to some very emotional support. Right? Now these things you cannot establish by science or proved by science or reduced to scientific method. Because, these are important things. So it's like this, we need rice and, these things to eat for our physically. But what about the arts? What about the theater? What about the drama, movie, poetry, these things? Now these are also people need in order to live because they fulfill the emotional satisfaction. But you can't really gauge by science. So in other words, now religion is a very interesting thing because people thought that with the development of science, religions will be gone. But it didn't happen. In fact, religions are even more powerful today. Now, for example, I'm not saying that the certain things are not going to affect religion. Now, for example, creationist story of the world, nobody believes in today. Interesting thing is even Christians don't believe it. Even Christians don't believe it because they interpret it indifferently. Now, the original idea was that the God is like big bearded whitish fair guy, and he created the universe and so on. But nobody believes that. Christians don't believe. And if you go that story today, Christians will laugh at you. But the very traditional people still believe the story, but usually people don't believe it anymore. Now you can see that religions also have changed accordingly. And then they have, they don't talk anymore about God, as a person. They talk about God as experience. So, the religions have also adjusted to it. However, because you asked this question, and because we are in a group of, studying Buddhism, it's interesting, although things like Sasajataka can be shown to be not right according to modern science. I mean, if you take the why Buddhism stands, Buddhism is supposed to be the fastest growing religion in a lot of parts of the world today, particularly in the Western world. Why is that? Because on the one hand, traditional Christianity is kind of disappearing. That's why these people are coming to Asian countries and trying to, some remote areas in Myanmar, some remote areas in India, they are going and they are trying to propagate their religion. But Buddhism is spreading all over the world. Now, basically because the whole idea of Four Noble Truths and dependent origination, they don't need the scientific support. Because, they are based on the, you can say, experience. Now, dukkha is an experience. So Buddhism starts with experience. Now, in that sense, you can say Buddhism is even scientific. But you don't have to say that because you don't need to help of the science in order to Buddhism to stand up. Buddhism can stand up on its own because Buddhism goes by experience. Human suffering. Now, when the Siddhartha, before his renunciation, what he thought was, in the Sanyutta Nikaya, there is a very interesting sutta which says, Kichchang vatayang loko apanno, jayati, jiyati, miyati, chavati uppajati. Kichchang vatayang loko apanno. This world has fallen into a big trouble, unfortunate situation. What is the unfortunate situation? Jayati, jiyati, miyati. They are born, they grow old, and they die. Now, Siddhartha saw in his own life that he is born, he is getting old, and then he dies. Not only in him, he saw entire world in the people. So he went in search of Buddhahood, not only for him. He went it for everybody. And then, now you see, now what he saw is in his own life, is his experience. When he said, Kichchang vatayang loko apanno, the world is in trouble, world is in a difficult situation, it is true about himself and it is true about entire world. So, Buddhism in that sense stands on experience. So, because it stands on experience, till suffering exists, Buddhism has to be valid. Till suffering exists. So, your question is very important. We can keep on discussing, Reverend, because how science has affected religion is very interesting. Because religions have made some changes, particularly creationist religion have made a lot of changes, in their ideas, in their approaches. But in Buddhism, if you want to prove that things like Sasajataka is right, then of course that's another thing. But if you think that, okay, those are stories, particularly stories like Sasajataka, not really 100% Buddhist, they are coming from the Indian tradition. Now, all cultures have stories like Sasajataka, where, some eminent, now here in the case of Bodhisattva, somebody has drawn the picture in the moon, It's like very typical, the folk story, very typical. So, we don't need to take these stories very seriously. We only must be serious about the lesson behind the story. For what purpose this story has been used in the Buddhist tradition. That's the most important thing. But basically what is more important in the basic teachings of the Buddha. Now, if the basic teachings have to be changed, then of course I don't think it is Buddhism anymore anyway. It can't be Buddhism, right? If there are no Four Noble Truths, you can't talk about Buddhism. So minus Four Noble Truths, you can't talk about Buddhism. There's no point of talking about Buddhism. That day we have to admit that, okay, Buddhism is of no use. Okay, everybody can go home. But it's not like changing things according to science, So there is a difference in the degree of. So definitely science has influenced religions. Not only, there are many levels. Say, for example, we are using modern technology here for our teaching. And then electronic preachers are there. They have sometimes their own television stations. They relay things all over the world. Radio stations and television. So we are using modern technology a lot. And then there are so many Dhamma blogs, so a lot of information. So today religions are also using modern technology quite a lot, scientific knowledge. So that way religions are using for their own advantage too. But the important thing is, the more serious thing is, with the arrival of knowledge, when people have improved knowledge, whether a religion can stand on its own. That's the important thing. Because if a religion needs the support of science to stand up, I think that's a problem. That's a problem. Religion must be stand on its own. Maybe religion can make use of science. You see the difference? But if a religion needs science in order to stand up, no good.
But I see almost people have a tendency to lie the latency symbol letters. It means they like to hear the hero story or legendary story, and they like something is not clear. But when we tell so clear, if we talk, we base on the science. Maybe some almost that they don't like.
Okay. Yeah, because sometimes it so happens people want to live in the mythical stories and mythical situations, and But again, interesting thing is, the science caters to human emotions very much. Now, in that emotional thing, we can't gauge by science. Now, for example, particularly the rites and rituals associated with science, religion. You can't, now, for example, I will give you an example from Sri Lanka. Now we are lighting oil lamps, right? Now basically the oil lamp is the light, the symbol of wisdom because it is light. And then ancient time we can believe that lamps, oil lamps were used people for dispel the darkness, right? But today with so much electricity and all that, we still light oil lamps. Now that shows that we are not using oil lamps in order to just do away with darkness. It's more symbolic. And then not only that, with all the electricity, sometimes we in Sri Lanka, we have the oil lamps, 84,000 oil lamps lit. 84,000. Now, somebody can, okay, somebody can ask, why 84,000? Why 10 is not enough? This is just a symbol. You see, there the point is, it is religion. Because if you feel that you have to do 84,000, you do it. Because, it's like, it's such a feeling. That feeling you can't gauge by science. You do it, you get it by doing it. So you can offer one flower, you can offer truckload of flowers, but then that depends on how you feel. So religion caters quite a lot to human emotions. That part I don't think we can take away from religion. I don't think anybody can talk about through scientific measurements, these things, So religion caters to that. I don't think that part should be underestimated or something, no. That's a very important part in religion. Because it's so, close to people's heart and, like that. So religion has that very interesting aspect. I remember one time I went to this area called Ladakh in India. And then actually Ladakh is considered to be the western part of Tibet, about 14,000 feet up. So when you go there, you can't even breathe, easily. So you have to really. So I went there, and then one day they took us to an ancient monastery. So we were taken by a vehicle and going through mountains and this thing, and very difficult path. And we finally went to this monastery, which was among the mountains. And then when we were entering it, actually upper part of the door was closed, inside was dark, and then we had to kind of crawl through like this. So I crawled through, and then a dark place, there was one oil lamp was lighting. Very elderly lady was, chanting something, okay? You wouldn't believe, I don't consider myself to be very religious. But, kind of tears started coming from my eyes because it's like my own grandmother. And then, I have come to this almost like end of the world, like in this remote place. And when you go in, you see this grand old lady, chanting. My God, what Buddhism has done, where Buddhism has come. So all this started coming into me. That is religion. Because, because you are grown up in that tradition, so you can't just look at that with equanimity. Because it's such a, simple thing, yes, but on the other hand, it's such a great thing, because that's what religion, so Reverend, religion has this very important aspect of emotional life. I think the significance of Buddhism is, in addition to that, Buddhism provides for some kind of deeper, existential human problem. Because ultimately, emotions are not the whole thing, right? You have other things, okay. So when we think about science and religion, we can see that science and religion are in a way kind of antithetical. But on the other hand, what I would like to show you is scientific method can be used. It is important for us to know some aspects of scientific method when you do our own Buddhist studies. Mainly because you can't ignore science today, because science is everywhere. Scientific knowledge is everywhere. You can't simply say that, no, we don't care. Okay? We can't say that. So we must know what it is and how they do things and how they acquire knowledge. It's up to us whether we want to follow it or not. That's a different thing. But we can't reject knowledge about it. Okay, so that's why I thought I should be talking to you. Okay, everyone, thank you. We will continue. So 2 ways of scientific reasoning, induction and deduction. Actually, today I wanted to introduce you these 2 things basically. 2 ways of scientific reasoning. Now, scientific reasoning. So, scientifically you reason about something. Scientifically you try to know about some particular thing. So, there are these 2 things, induction and deduction. Now, let us know basically what these 2 means. So, induction is called bottom-up logic, method of arriving at general statements by means of particular statement. Example is we say X is human, X died. Y is human, Y dies. Therefore, all human beings die. Now, basically when we say induction, inductive reasoning or induction means we can say inductive reasoning is arriving at general statement through particular statements. You arrive at a general statement through particular statement. So, your conclusion is general, but you come to this thing through particular statement. It's something like this. We say X is the name of a man, X is human, X died. So we can say Y, X, C. We can say V. So on and so forth we can go. Ultimately we say all now this is basically example for induction. This is basically example for induction. How do you come to inductive knowledge is when you say all human beings die, we are saying something very interesting. We say all human beings die. Now, it's a present tense, we say all human beings die. But what it means is all human beings in the past died. All human beings living now will be dead. All human beings who will be born in future will also be dead. So when we say all human beings die, we are making a very general statement which is applicable to past, present and future. Right? That's what it means. All human beings die means all human beings in the past, in the present, in the future will die. So we are talking about the general thing that is happening. But how do we come to know that? How do we come to know that? Now we observe. What we observe is, okay, X is a human being, after some time he died. So we have seen people are born and then people die. Right? People are born and people die. And then finally we come to a conclusion. Our conclusion is what we call general conclusion. Or the same thing, you can use the word universal conclusion. General conclusion, or you can use the term universal conclusion. So from set of particular statement, you derive a universal conclusion. What is the particular statement? X is human being is, we are talking only one person. And then he died. Y is human being, we are talking on one person. But having talked about limited number of particular people, we draw a universal conclusion. Our universal conclusion is we say all human beings die. So, in other words, our observations are limited, and our conclusion is unlimited. Okay? Applicability of conclusion is unlimited. When we say all human beings die, actually we are talking about all human beings. All means all. Okay? All means all. So, we are talking about, so we get a universal statement or a general statement through this particular statement by observation, by observing these things. However, when you look at it, now I refer to Siddhartha, when he thought, Kichang vatayang loko apanno jayati jiyati miyati. World is in trouble, they are born, they become old and they die. How did he know that? Now, again, that is the inductive knowledge. Because so far, maybe Buddha's time didn't have a record of people living 150 years or something. Everybody around 100 dies, right? So, ultimately Buddha says that everybody is dying. So what is the use of this? Now you see, this is a inductive type of understanding. But there is something strange here. Even though we say all human beings die, are we really sure? Are we really sure? Like, can't we ask, isn't there a possibility that one of us going to be undying or something, living forever? Well, that sounds a little bit ridiculous because, like human beings die. But, sometimes there are certain things, like we say some other statements, like we say all swans are white. All swans are white. Now, of course, later they found swans not white, so now it is gone anyway. But there was a period people believed that all swans are white. Okay, but isn't it possible that there are swans belonging to different colors? Now that example is not as serious as all human beings are going to die. But what about the swans? In fact, then they discovered swans, black swans. So then, up to that point they said all swans are white. But then when they discovered black swans, of course, all swans are white is wrong. So they had to reject that. So, but up to that point people thought that all swans are white. When you say all swans are white, swans anywhere in the world is white. Maybe you observe swans in Myanmar, observe swans in Sri Lanka, observe swans in Switzerland and Russia. Okay, white. But in order to say that, have you observed all the swans in the entire world? Can you observe? We can never observe. We can never observe all the swans in the world anyway at any given moment. But why we cannot? Practical difficulties. But if we really want to spend millions of dollars and put people all the corners in the world and behind the mountains and top of the mountains, we can do that. But of course, people are not going to do that, the crazy thing. So whenever we say that all swans are white, what we say is, we make a general statement. But we understand that in a general statement, we really are not sure whether it is going to continue to be true. So basically, the situation is, in the conclusions arrived in this manner, no certainty can be achieved. So the key word is certainty. Certainty means, you are sure about the result. Only probability is achieved. Now, certainty and probability. So in the inductive knowledge, inductive reasoning, what you basically achieve is probability. You can never get certainty. Now, when we say all swans are white, there is always a possibility that non-white swans can exist. But when we say that all human beings die, it is problematic because I am not sure whether we can really argue that there can be a human being who is not going to die. Because at least according to Buddhist philosophy, what is the reason for the death? According to Buddhist philosophy, what is the reason for death? Pardon me?
To be reborn again.
Say it again.
To be reborn again.
To be reborn again, okay, but no, that's true, but that's not exactly the answer. That comes fairly okay. But what is the reason for death?
Reason for death.
Pardon me? Well, the reason for death according to Buddhism is the fact that you are born. If you are born, you are going to die. So that's what the Buddha says.
Like our body is not balanced.
Natti jata samaranam. If you are born, there is no non-death or something. So basic reason according to Buddhism is actually you are born. That is why you are going to die. So that's why Buddhism says that jati pacchaya jara marana. I mean, you can't have jati without jara marana. According to Paticamuppada. Very fact that you have jati means you have jara marana. So according to Buddhism, so I don't think actually we can argue really as a universal statement, I mean question whether all human beings die according to Buddhism. But still somebody can say, there could be a possibility, somebody not dying. But there are other better examples like, all souls are white or things like that. So, but anyhow what you get is ultimately probability. Even the strongest inductive claim cannot have 100% certainty. So probability can be like 9.9999. But still not 100. Still not 100. Because it's still probability. Now for example, if you take a statement like sun will rise tomorrow. Anybody doubt? No. Anybody doubt? No. But why? I mean, what is the reason? What is the reason actually? If you think, okay, we are so sure that sun is going to rise tomorrow morning again. But then why we think so? Because it has risen so far. From the date you are born up to today, no day where there was no sun rising. And if you ask your parents or grandparents or anybody, nobody knows the date where sun has not risen, right? That's why we say sun will rise tomorrow without any problem. But, are we sure? So we can say sun will rise tomorrow morning has 99.9999 points, certainty. I mean, but probability, but not 100% certainty. So, in other words, some inductive knowledge is more probable, some inductive knowledge is less probable, right? So the probability can be very high or very low. But what it means is basically in scientific knowledge what you get is, so the inductive conclusions are accordingly either strong or weak but not valid or invalid. This valid and invalid distinction I will talk to you later. Today if we have time, basically the inductive conclusions are accordingly either strong or weak but not valid or invalid. So we can talk about strong inductive conclusions or weak but not valid or invalid. Valid or invalid come in the deductive propositions. I will come to it later. Even if all the premises are true, conclusion could be false. Now another important thing is, even if all the premises are true, conclusion can be false. For example, you say that I observed sun in Myanmar, it is white. I observed sun in Mandalay, it is in white. I observed in China, it is white. So all your premises are true, but still there can be a non-white sun. So all your conclusions are true, but still all your premises are true, but your conclusion can be wrong. But in the deductive argument, which I will be describing next, in the deductive argument, if your conclusions are true, then I'm mixing up again. If your premises are true, then your conclusion has to be true. Okay, why don't you take a short break, okay? And then we will come back to this, okay? Okay, we will continue. So the last part of the discussion I showed you two ways of scientific reasoning, induction and deduction. I gave you some main features of induction or inductive reasoning. We use the word induction or inductive reasoning. So induction can be a method, okay? Induction. Induction has, as you know, many meanings. In this context, induction is inductive reasoning in order to get knowledge, okay? Basically, induction is called scientific method because it is the empirical method. Now, we decide, we come to say all human beings are mortal? Because based on our observation. Now, this particular statement, all human beings are mortal, we don't even need to observe it because it is so much taken for granted from the origin of humanity. But, if somebody defies this, start living, say, 300-400 years, then what? It will have to be revised, so something like that. Okay, moving on, problems of inductive reasoning. David Hume, British empiricist philosopher, pointed out that inductive reasoning can never give conclusions with certainty, that you know now. According to Hume, inductive reasoning is based on assumption that future will be like past. Future will be like past. By observing recurrent phenomena, we draw conclusions, but there is no guarantee that past will repeat itself to the future. Now, this David Hume is a very remarkable British philosopher. He lived in about 250 years back, like 17th and 18th centuries. And he came up with what's called this problem of induction. Now we have to remember, now Middle Ages are over. Now we have passed 15th century, we have passed 16th century. Now by 16th century, Isaac Newton lived, Francis Bacon. So there were some, the beginning of great scientists. But Hume pointed out some very serious problem in scientific method. Now if the scientific method is induction, Hume said that this scientific method has a serious problem. That serious problem is how can you guarantee that same thing will be repeating in future. Now, say for example, the same example if you take, so far human beings have died. So based on that we say all human beings die. But somebody can ask, how if that past will not be repeated for future? Then what? Let me go into my other example. We will say for definitively that sun will rise tomorrow because it has risen so far. In other words, the assumption behind the whole thing is that past will be repeated in future, right? That is the assumption. Now, Hume asked, what is the guarantee? Why do we believe that? What is the guarantee? Why do we believe that? Because very often what we do is, when we see certain patterns, we make certain general conclusions. I remember, this is a personal story, but I will tell you, when I was a graduate student, I was, after lunch, we were just sitting and talking as a habit. Then every time we were sitting and talking, we see this man and woman, walking. So I said to my friend, looks like they have become friends or something. Then my friend, half jokingly said, no, they are just walking together. Now, you see the difference. Now, what I see is, they are just walking together. But what I said is my interpretation. But I don't know, I never know that whether they have really become friends or something. Right? Boyfriend and girlfriend, that's what I mean. But why did I say that? Because I say them walking together every time, so I said that. But my friend jokingly said that, no, they must be just walking together. That is what I really see. That is our empirical knowledge. But based on that empirical knowledge, we come to conclusions. It's exactly what Hume said. Because we see certain things, based on those things, we build up theories. We have seen sun rising up to this point, so we will assume that it will happen tomorrow also. It will happen tomorrow also. This is the really problematic thing, because there are certain areas it will not happen. Suppose, there has been a person who has doing this particular bad thing up to today, but it is quite possible that he will not do it tomorrow. He will not do it never again after tomorrow. Then what? Inductive reasoning is gone wrong, right? I mean, simply because of, that person's behavior was such up to this point, you cannot with 100% assurance. It could happen or it could not happen. But we do this all the time, right? We do it all the time. Sometimes we say okay, the mother is bad, so therefore daughter is also going to be bad. But mother is bad, all right, but the daughter can be quite a good person. Then what? Inductive reasoning is gone bad. Doesn't work that way. So, Hume's objection was very interesting. Hume said, based on the assumption that future will be like the past, by observing recurrent phenomena, when something happens repeatedly, based on that we make certain theories. We draw conclusions. But there is no guarantee that past will repeat itself to the future. I mean, we cannot have a guarantee that past will happen exactly. Now, this is something Hume wanted to show, that this inductive reasoning has an issue. I mean, if you really think, it is based on ultimately certain assumptions which are not really scientific. I mean, we go by the observation. Our observations are always limited. But the claims we make go always beyond the observation. Right? When we say all human beings are mortal, we make a large statement which is universal to everybody. So under certain conditions, we make that. Now, any scientific research is like that. You make a limited observation and experiment, but then you make a general conclusion. Suppose you are a scientist who want to do something like pineapple sourness, or something like how to get the more productivity. Now, for example, in many countries, including Sri Lanka, we have the research on rice, and they do a lot of research on rice, and they try to produce rice with more crop. You get more crop from that, so more productivity. Now, you do that research in a particular place in Sri Lanka. But if that result is only applicable to that particular place, is that science? No. Your result must be applicable to anywhere in the world with that climatic condition, right? With that climatic and other conditions, it must be applicable to anywhere. Otherwise, so you do a limited amount of research, but you draw a universal conclusion, right? So this nature is there. I mean, everywhere in any kind of natural scientific things, you always do limited number of research, and then you draw certain conclusions. Suppose you are as a sociologist, you want to study a particular village and the culture, and you go to that village. But if your study is only limited to that village, what is the use of that? No, actually your study has to be applicable to all the other similar places. Now that is science. But of course you can't do your research in all those places. You only take one typical place. Maybe live there several months or something and do what is called field research. Field research is always limited to some particular place. But then the results you are going to draw out of field research are going to be universal, in the sense under those similar circumstances, those things have to happen anywhere in the world. Now, Hume said that there are relations of ideas and matters of fact. Propositions related to relations of ideas are necessary, a priori, and analytic. Propositions related to matters of facts are contingent, a posteriori, synthetic. These three pairs of categories respectively refer to reality, knowledge, and language. That this passage can be a little bit dense. Let me explain it to you. Hume said another interesting category he made. He said things we deal with usually in studies are two different things. They are relations of ideas and matters of facts. You have relation of ideas and the other is matters of fact. Relation of, we say, relation of ideas, matters of fact. Now, relations of ideas are like how things are related. Now, they are not really related to how things are in the world. But, basically now when we say 2 plus 2 equals 4, that's a relation of ideas. Now, 2 plus 2 equals 4 doesn't say anything about the world, right? But if I say that there are 100 chairs in this hall, then of course it is a matter of fact. We can count and then we can see whether there are 100 chairs in this hall or not. That's a matter of fact. Matter of facts are factual things about the world. But the other things are relations of ideas, like we can say in, on, under, these, things like that. Something is bigger and the biggest, and that sort of ideas. All these things are relations of ideas. Now, relations of ideas is said necessary, a priori, analytic. Now, relations of ideas are necessary, a priori, analytic. Look at this sentence. All bachelors are unmarried. All bachelors are BAC, not T, right? I'm not sure. BACHE maybe. All bachelors are bachelor. Bachelor means what? Unmarried. All bachelors are unmarried. Now, this statement is what? This statement we can consider relation of ideas. It is necessary, a priori, analytic. Now, we will start from the word analytic. Analytic means, in order to know whether this statement is true or false, what do you need to do? Maximum you have to do is look at a dictionary. Right? Now, if I say there are 100 chairs in this room, if you want to know whether it is true or false, what should we do? Come and count them. Right? But if you want to know this statement, whether it is true or not, what should we do? Just look at the dictionary maximum, right? If whether it is true or not, you just look at the dictionary. You analyze it. When you analyze it. Now, same thing, if I write 2 plus 2 equals 4, what do you do in order to know whether it is true or not? You just analyze it. Analytically, when you analyze the statement, you can know whether it is true or false. 2 plus 2 equals 4. Do you need to count 2 chairs make it 4 or something? No, you don't need to do that. You just look at the mathematical statement. A priori means before experience. Again, that means you don't need to go to the experience. You don't need to go into the counting the chairs or anything. You can just by doing that a priori means without experience, in your knowledge, in your thinking, right? And then necessary. Necessary means, can you say that bachelors are not married? Why not? Because, we give this definition, bachelor is a person who is not married, right? So, can we say bachelors are not married without violating the language? You can't say that, because whenever you say bachelor, you say that it is a married, right? Because there are certain things, you are making a self-contradictory statement otherwise. So, if you say something like, my mother doesn't have children. You are making a self-contradictory statement, right? Because if somebody is your mother, when you say that she doesn't have children, that cannot be. So what it means is, I'm just trying to see what Hume meant. What Hume meant is, there are certain statements in the language, in the things we are dealing with, they are logical, they are mathematical. We don't need to go to the world to see whether they are true or not. They are a priori, that means without experience you can know them. They are necessary, because if you say negative, it becomes false. And then they are analytic. Analytic means you analyze the statement, you can see that the statement is true, right? All bachelors are unmarried. You can just look at the book and see bachelor means unmarried. Okay, so that's it. So now this is basically what he meant. All the relations of ideas are necessary, a priori and analytic. Now propositions related to matters of facts are contingent, a posteriori, synthetic. Now, I will give you the same example I gave you. We can say all X has 100 tables. Now this is matters of fact. They are contingent. What is contingent? Contingent means contingent or dependent on the situations. Now if there are no 100 chairs in the whole X, then of course it is false. So it is contingent upon, depending on the external situation. So they are contingent. Contingent is the opposite of necessary. Now necessary statement is, you cannot say without contradicting no to it, right? Necessary statement is necessarily true. But contingent statements, whether they are true or not, depend on the other things, right? So if there are no 100 chairs in the whole X, of course it is false. But no such thing for all bachelors are unmarried, because it is not contingent. It depends on the definition of the term. 2 plus 2 equals 4. And then contingent a posteriori. A posteriori means Latin term after experience. So you come to the whole X and you count. That means your experience. So it is truth or falsehoodness depends on a posteriori. Simply by analyzing you can't know it. You have to come to this whole and count it. And then synthetic. Synthetic means whether the statement is true or not, you can't just say by analyzing the statement. The statement becomes true if there are only 100 chairs, otherwise it becomes false. However, all bachelors are unmarried, nothing like that. It is in order to know that it is true, of course, you don't have to have, it is an analytic statement. In other words, we talk about things like these relations, necessary, contingent, priori, posteriori, analytic, and then we talk about the synthetic. Now these are three different pairs of ideas for you to keep in your mind. Now you can see that in order to, when we look at these things, basically relations of ideas and matters of facts, they have to be treated in two different manners. Again, I want to tell you that these distinctions are not hard and fast. Based on this distinction, Hume talks about, and some others also talk about, facts and values. They say that facts are facts. Values are like, what people think and what people feel. But that kind of sharp division not accepted by many people today. So there are difficulties with any of these philosophical positions. However, in general, what Hume says is true. In general, when we talk about two different things. Now, if you take mathematics, if you take logic or statistics, similar things are dealing with not about, with the objects, right? Mathematics is basically relations of ideas, right? In order to do mathematics, we don't have to really look at anything about the world. Just in the computer, you can do that. But the field research you can do in the computer. You have to go to the field. You have to go to the village. You have to go to the where it is. Now, this is the difference. So, relations of ideas, you don't have to have any reference to the, basically the world. You do it conceptually, philosophically, mathematically, logically. And then the other things, of course, you have to do with the contingent, a posteriori, synthetic statements, so now, problem of inductive reasoning, basically the Hume suggested this, how scientific knowledge can be reliable if this is the situation. Actually, when you study Western philosophy, it is very interesting. The Immanuel Kant came after Hume. Immanuel Kant said that he was awakened from his dogmatic slumber when he read Hume, because he thought that Hume's challenge to science was very serious, because science was emerging. Now, Hume was showing something very bad about scientific procedure, because according to Hume, scientific procedure cannot give us 100% certainty. But, on the other hand, we don't live with 100% certainty anyway, right? So, we can say that we don't need 100% certainty, but technically looking, what Hume said is something very interesting. Now, based on this, there came two philosophical positions, verification and falsification. Logical positivists held that the scientific truths must be verifiable. The scientists must be able to establish the truthfulness of scientific assertions conclusively. Now, this verifiability is the philosophical idea presented by the group of philosophers called logical positivism. Now, this logical positivism as a school of philosophy was very powerful, particularly in the first couple of decades in the last century, like 20th century. This philosophical school started in Austria, sometimes called Vienna Circle. Vienna Circle is actually these people, basically scientists and people inspired by science used to meet in Vienna. That's the capital city of Austria. So they were called the Vienna Circle. So the Vienna Circle people came up with what is called logical positivism. So this is their philosophical view. Sorry. Logical positivists accepted this a priori, a posteriori distinction. Certain things we come to know by experience, other things, basically something similar to what Hume said, relations of ideas and the matters of fact. Now, logical positivists came up with the idea of verification. What they meant by verification is any scientific theory, statement must be able to verify it. You must be able to prove it to be right or wrong. That is the verification. Verify, verification, verifiability thesis. So all these terms are used, but basically, now according to this view, logical positivists that ethics, aesthetics and things like that, what you asked about the religion, they said all these things have to be kept aside because they are not scientific. Now in that sense, their view was very limited really. They said that ethics, aesthetics, concept of beauty, good and bad, all these things are really kept aside because they are not verifiable. They are not verifiable, but that's a totally different philosophical aspect which I don't want to discuss. But concerning scientific knowledge, now this idea of verification is very important. Now they held that science must be able to verify, ultimately prove that something to be. So they said verifiability is the most important thing in science. Whatever comes as science, you must be able to prove it conclusively. Okay, that is what the verifiability. Logical positivists held that the scientific truths must be verifiable. The scientists must be able to establish the truthfulness of scientific assertions conclusively. Now, coming to Hume, Hume's objection to induction highlights that inductive reasoning cannot be conclusively verified. Science deals with matters of fact and they are contingent, based on experience, and synthetic. Truth or otherwise of a proposition has to be decided with reference to matters outside proposition. The middle paragraph I just described to you. So Hume's objection to induction highlights that inductive reasoning cannot be conclusively. Now, although logical positivists maintain that verifiability is the most important thing, Hume's objection, of course, logical positivists came later, but if you go by the Hume's objection, you can't do that. Science deals with matters of fact. Science basically deals with matters of fact, not with mathematics or logic or anything. But don't misunderstand, mathematics, logic and all these things can be used in scientific investigations, but science basically deals with reality, about the world, about the things that happen. So basically matters of fact. And they are contingent, which means can be otherwise, right? I mean, if you say 2 plus 2 equals 4, it will be same anywhere in the world, any day, right? In a way. But if there are 100 chairs in this hall, that's contingent. Somebody can remove 10 chairs. Somebody can bring more chairs. I mean, there are many, they are contingent on various different situations, contingent. Can be otherwise. Based on experience, a posteriori. Experience means whether it is true or not, you have to come and check. You can't do it by logical reasoning or mathematical calculation. You remember my example of Johannes Copernicus and Galileo. The difference is Copernicus knew that Earth is going around the sun and not the vice versa by mathematics. But it was established by Galileo by empiricism, empirical method, by observing it. So a posteriori and synthetic, the truth or otherwise of a proposition has to be decided with reference to matters outside the proposition. Proposition means sentences. Now all bachelors are unmarried. In order to establish it is true, you don't have to go beyond the sentence. Within the sentence you can establish it. 2 plus 2 equals 4, don't need to go outside. But X has 100 chairs, you have to do something totally different. So accordingly, the philosophers such as Karl Popper proposed falsifiability instead of verifiability. Now these two words, verification and falsification, verifiability and falsifiability, being able to falsify. So Karl Popper proposed falsifiability instead of verifiability. Falsification means that a scientific proposition can be disproved, falsified conclusively, although it may not be verified, B is missing, not be verified conclusively. What it means is, with one counterexample, an inductive assertion can be disproved, but with any number of supporting evidence, it may be highly probable but not certain. What do you mean by with one counterexample, inductive assertion can be disproved? Now, for example, take this, we say all anyway, now this is false because there are non-white zones, but anyway, we will take this. All zones are white. What do you mean by this? One counterexample can disprove. Now, suppose we believe that all zones are white, then I go to some country, nobody has gone there, but still zones are white there. So then what I do is, I support that theory, but still it is probable, not 100% certain. And people go anywhere in the world, everywhere they find all zones are white, but no non-white zones. then what happens is this statement all zones are white get more and more strong. But can you conclusively decide that all zones are white? No, because there is still a possibility somewhere on earth nobody has seen there can be a non-white zone, because there is no logical impossibility, right? It is possible. Only thing is we have not discovered it. But logically impossible bachelor to be not married. Okay? But all zones are white can be logically, I mean, you can, there is a possibility that, you know, there is some unobserved non-white zone. However, okay, hundreds, thousands or millions of all the zones are white. However, if you find one non-white zone, what happens? Can you say all zones are white now? No. You can't say. Now, you see the situation is with whatever number of discoveries of white zones, what you do is you can further strengthen the thesis. But with the discovery of one counterexample, you can't say all. So this is the falsifiability. So what Karl Popper showed, Karl Popper showed that a scientific theory can never be conclusively verified. But scientific theory can be conclusively falsified. With one counterexample, if you say all zones are white, in order to disprove that, one non-white zone is enough. One non-white zone, because you can't say all then. It's simple enough, right? How can you say all? There is at least one. So falsifiability comes from this observation. So Karl Popper thought that you can falsify it with one counterexample. Read it again. According to the philosophers such as Karl Popper proposed falsifiability instead of verifiability. Falsifiability means that a scientific proposition can be disproved conclusively, although it may not be verified conclusively. With one counterexample, an inductive assertion can be disproved, although with any number of supporting evidence, it may be only highly probable, but not certain. Now you see, now all this falsification and verification, again concerned with the scientific knowledge. So some scientists started saying that in order for something to be a scientific statement, we must be able to verify it. Now, I mean, we have to understand these things very carefully. Of course, I don't personally believe that verification is completely out. I mean, very often what we do is, you know, suppose we do earlier we talked about the testability. Whenever you say something, others must be able to test it, right? So I say something, you test it and you find the same thing. Now you are verifying what I said, right? So I mean, verifiability is not, but verifiability as a thesis was anyhow given up, because they thought that ultimately the scientific assertions, if you look at them, they are open to be disproved. Now this is something very important aspect of scientific knowledge, because scientific knowledge does not have like Four Noble Truths. They don't have that type of truths, okay? Now this is one reason why you cannot compare Buddhism with science. In the scientific thing, any assertion can be falsified by further research. So whatever scientific view accepted up to today can be disproved by a scientist tomorrow. I mean, that possibility is there. It can be disproved. But when we talk about Buddhism, if we can disprove Four Noble Truths, we can all pack up and go home, because, you know, if Four Noble Truths don't remain, Buddhism doesn't remain. But the Four Noble Truths are not open for that kind of negotiation, right? According to Buddhism, so long as human beings are born, they are going to die. So long as we are dying, we are upset about it. So that is dukkha. So it is there. But anyhow, this whole thing is, you know, very interesting. Falsifiability and verifiability. So ultimately, any scientific statement is basically falsifiable. That means you can't have scientific, so-called scientific truths to be fixed. I mean, that's a good nature of science because that's how science develops. Scientists say that you always challenge the existing knowledge. If you are satisfied with the existing knowledge, knowledge will never grow. You have to challenge it. Now, if you look at your own subject, Buddhist studies, you have to challenge it. I mean, in this country, there are so great Buddhist teachers. The other day, I visited this monastery of Ashin Janaka and huge monastery, and I understand he has written so many books on Abhidharma. But if you think that Janaka is the last word, what he said is everything is true, knowledge is never going to grow up. You have to challenge him. You have to see that whether anything can be improved on him. If you really think that completely your mind, okay, he wrote and we cannot really challenge it, then you can never grow up your knowledge, Reverend. Whoever said and done, you are able to, now if you take science, Isaac Newton in the 16th century said certain things. Albert Einstein in the 20th century disproved some of those things. But if we had so much respect for Isaac Newton, will science be developing? No. Actually, science is a result of challenging the existing knowledge. Every time you challenge the existing knowledge, something better can come up. That's the idea. So the development is the same thing with our scholarship also. Because if you don't challenge it, if you think that okay, he said the final word, the knowledge in our field will never develop. Now, in my when I talk about scientific, other things I will talk. But any PhD dissertation, we say new knowledge. Actually, any PhD dissertation, you challenge existing knowledge. If you can't do that, you don't exist as a scholar, really. We are not doing it. It is not a wrong thing to do. But challenging the existing scholarship is a must in research. That doesn't mean that you are disrespecting that person. Also, that doesn't mean that you are going to be similar to that person. No. Albert Einstein once said that he has climbed up to the shoulders of the giants. Now, even though you are such a small person, if you are on the shoulder of a giant, then you see little more than the giant sees, right? Right? But then, of course, you are on the shoulder of that giant. That's why you see little bit more. So, our case also, you have to climb to the shoulder. That means you have to get their whole knowledge. And then you will be seeing little bit more and then somebody else will come and climb into your shoulder and will see little more than that. The next person will be seeing little more. This is how scientific knowledge develops. Scientific knowledge has developed for last 300-400 years like that. Knowledge always develops with these things, Reverend. Like you look at the history. If Buddha was satisfied with Brahmanism, would Buddhism be there? If Siddhartha was satisfied with Brahmanism, no Buddhism. He challenged it. Isn't he? When Buddha went to Alar Kalama, he got the Rupa Jhanas, and Alar Kalama thought that fine, so you accept my pupils and stay. But Siddhartha said, no thank you. He went beyond that. Then Uddaka Ramaputta, he got Arupa Jhana. But did he stop there? No. He went beyond that. So you have to challenge. You challenge your teacher. You don't accept it. Then you go beyond that. So these academic studies are something like that. Science is a very good example. So science is accumulation of knowledge. Science is not by one man or one person, one woman or anything like that. So it's an accumulation of the large number of people. So accordingly, the verification theorists held that you have to verify something, verifiability, but others said that no, it is not verifiability, it is more the falsifiability is what matters. Let me talk a little bit about the deductive reasoning, and then I will be talking about validity and soundness of things. Actually, we are sort of running out of time, and then deductive reasoning is something which we need little bit longer discussion. So why don't I wind up from here today, and then maybe I will discuss with you these things next week. But before we conclude for today, I would like to see whether you have any questions or comments.